So my name is Zach. I'm going to be the Prime Minister for Horace Mann Dalton. I use he, him pronouns, and if you have any POIs, just let me know verbally.
And I'm Emily. I use she, her pronouns, and I will be the member of government for Horace Mann Dalton. I also prefer POIs verbally.
Okay, I'm Jacob. I'm from Berkeley. I'm on opposition. I'll take my POIs verbally as well. All on mute.
My name is Elisandra. My pronouns are she, her. I'll take POIs verbally. I'm going to be the second speaker for opposition.
Wonderful. Okay, so with that, shocker, my name has not changed. I'm still Zach. If you cut out for whatever reason, just let me know throughout my speech. I'm happy to stop and pause and start over. So with that being said, my time will begin in 3, 2, 1. People are more than just a number. The problem with utilitarianism is that it treats people as a pawn in a larger game of ethical chess. On side government, we reject the premise that people are merely a pawn. I've never been prouder to propose. I'm going to be doing two things in this speech. First, I'm going to be providing some top-of-case analysis as to what this debate is really about, provide burdens for my opponents and definitions for what these ethical frameworks look like. Second, you're going to hear three independent arguments coming from side government's bench. But first, what is a rights-based ethics? We think it's like ethics that's centered around civil rights, fundamental rights that like everyone should have. So that's like saying that, like, for example, that you shouldn't be prejudiced, that you shouldn't be able to discriminate, even if that discrimination creates net utile outcomes. That leads me into utilitarianism, which is essentially looking at like the consequences of an action first, not the intention, and specifically looking at what does the most good for the most number of people. We think that's going to be incredibly important.
Point of
What
information?
is that clarification or information?
Information.
Sure, I'll take it.
Yeah, how do you determine what a right is?
We think that, like, broadly speaking, if you look at like virtue ethics or deontology, both of these have some like pretty fundamental like rights. You shouldn't instrumentalize someone. You should treat everyone equally. Fairness, equality, agency, these are all things that we hold dear. We think that these are like the pillars of all rights-based ethical frameworks are pretty much based on those specifically. More on that when I get to our case. Some burdens for my opponents. We think that in order to win this debate, my opponents must prove that when people think about what the ethical choice for something is, because we think that there are other considerations, that in general, we ought to have like rights-based ethics be the one that is considered first. With that being said, our first argument is about treatment of marginalized groups. We think that utilitarianism has historically been used as a way to continue to uphold systems of oppression. How has that been seen in the past? We think that specifically, the fact that utilitarianism is centered around the number of people that something helps, it justifies atrocity, the displacement of indigenous people, the institution of slavery in the United States. Both of these terrible systems were justified under the notion of the greater good, i.e. that yes, there is harm to a few indigenous people, but if that allows us to expand and create a fantastic economy in the long term, it is justified. We think this form of thinking is bad because it treated individual people as a fundamental pawn. We think that that is fundamentally unjust. Let me provide a second example, though. We think that, for example, we think it is more wrong for a company to target 50 Black employees and fire them than to fire 100 employees at random because of their bad work. Even if the unemployment consequences of firing the 100 employees causes more harm, we think that targeting individual people in a prejudiced way is fundamentally unjust. Our second subpoint under this argument is about innocent people. You can look here to the justice system because if someone is widely believed to be guilty, but the court knows them to be innocent, we know that convicting them is good from a utilitarian perspective to discourage other crimes, but we don't just throw them in jail. Why? It's called the criminal justice system, not the criminal utilitarian system. I think there's a reason for that, judges. It's that we ought to care about justice when we are like giving out punishments as a society. As an underview to this argument, why do marginalized groups come first in today's debate? I.e., if we can prove that marginalized groups are harmed more on their side of the house, why does that mean we win? First is the principle of agency. We think that when making ethical decisions, we ought to help the people who have the least agency in society. Second is the principle of reparation. We think that because marginalized people have been historically oppressed, we ought to make up for past oppression by prioritizing them front and center. But then third and finally, we think that debate spaces like the one we are in today have historically excluded and marginalized these voices. Finally, putting them front and center ought to be considered first on your ballot. Our second argument concerns probability. We think that quantifying the good or bad of an action is impossible. We think you cannot actually define or measure benefits or costs, whereas it's far easier to identify whether an action is good or bad in principle. Let me explain this through an example. We all probably disagree what the impacts of Medicare for all would be if we passed a policy, but we all probably do agree that killing someone is fundamentally unjust. They're going to come up and say, well, how do you determine what's a right? No, thank you. How do you determine it? It's incredibly subjective. Turn this argument. We think it is less subjective. Everyone in this Zoom room can agree that certain things are bad. Racism is bad, that xenophobia is bad. These are things we all agree on. We don't agree on Medicare for all would be good or bad. The second subpoint, though, to this argument is that when an action is taken, the consequences of that action are just unknown. There are just so many alternative actors that are able to influence practical impacts. 100 years from now, the world will look very different. The impact of a policy, who knows what the world will look like? But we do know when there is a principled breach of, for example, agency, or when we instrumentalize a group, or when we use a group as a political pawn in a larger system. We think that these things are incredibly universal. Two impacts. First, probability acts as a fundamental prerequisite to their case, because if you don't actually know whether it's going to be good or bad, you can't use it as a framework in the first place. Second, we think it allows bad actors to abuse consequentialism. We think this looks like actors like Donald Trump or like colonizers using the greater good analysis to justify their atrocities. Our third argument is that agency is a prerequisite to any utility. The reason for this is that utility, that is happiness or success, is not intrinsically valuable. Things are only valuable because we ascribe value to them and then derive value from those things. For instance, it's not the case that an apple has intrinsic value, but rather that as humans, we assign value to apples and thus derive utility from eating them. In other words, it's not the happiness that we get from, for instance, debating that's morally salient, but rather our ability to assign value to debate as an activity that's intrinsically morally salient. This means that autonomy is the logical prerequisite to utility and thus must be weighed over any practical outcomes. At the end of today's debate, Judge, do not lose track of the principle. Do not let people be treated as pawns. Treat them as individuals, like they deserve to be treated. I've never been prouder to propose.
Okay, wonderful. My name's Jacob Goldman. All right. No, utilitarianism doesn't make people consider it as a pawn. It acknowledges that happiness is important and seeks to maximize that happiness. That is not using it as a pawn, it values happiness. I'm going to go over two opposition arguments today and then down Gov case. Before that, though, I want to do some framing on what this round really looks like. Government doesn't define for you who is preferring this and when they should be preferring it. We will. Preferring it looks like when should you be using which system? And what we are going to tell you is that you should be using the system of utilitarianism when making a decision, and every day you should be prioritizing it over a rights-based approach. With that out of the way, let's go down to opposition contentions. The first argument out of opposition is that rights-based ethics are logically contradictory in many instances. So subpoint A is that me exercising my rights will very often inherently infringe upon the rights of others. A really good example of this is property ownership in America. In the US, if I own land, I'm generally acknowledged to have the right to own that land. However, it generally denies the rights specifically of Native Americans to own that property that they used to have. That means that there is a logical contradiction that in order for me to have the right to property, I must deny it from someone else. There are other things, there are other instances of that. Furthermore, I have the right to own my own property, but it can be infringed via a government like taxing it away. So maybe I'm recognized to have my own right to property, but evidently it's okay to be taxed away. And it's very unclear at what point you decide that that infringes upon my rights. Notice how that is a contradiction. That in order to safeguard the rights of other peoples, government have to tax me so they can provide social welfare to others that keep people alive, but that infringes upon my rights. There's a contradiction there that cannot be resolved. Notice how utilitarianism resolves this contradiction. It says, yes, it's okay. I'll take it in a second. It's okay to tax me because it's okay to do that if it is maximizing the utility, if it is making other people happy, if it is allowing them social welfare. Let's see. Okay, the impacts of this is that the moral framework of a rights-based approach doesn't actually help you. In other words, I don't know whether something is justified if it allows me to have a right because it might infringe upon the right of other people, which means it's totally unclear whether something is justified or not, and it's incredibly difficult to resolve that. But then the second is that Kant argues that logical contradictions inherently make something immoral, and that's because A, there's no way to determine if something is permissible or not because you can't logic it out, and B, because it's probably selfish. That is, I usually will say that I have the right to something and I will maintain my rights even if it means infringing upon the rights of others because I am myself. I'll take a POI.
Do you think it's better for there to be an apparent contradiction or a contradiction that's hidden behind a veil of verisimilitude?
Okay, I don't think there actually is a contradiction to utilitarianism. I'll get to that later. But also, just because you can see that there's a contradiction doesn't mean that you can resolve it, especially if you're like a selfish person, as we all are, given that we feel our own pain, right? So I'm probably going to prefer my own rights over those of others. With that, let's get into subpoint B, and that is that a rights-based system is vague and arbitrary. There is no way to measure the extent of like what a right should be. So for example, it's really makes sense to say that everyone should have a comfortable life. Everyone has a right to a comfortable life. But that doesn't really work in a non-utopian society when we have like, poverty in the world that we can't just solve. So it's not really helpful to say that you have a right to something when that right must be infringed. In contrast, utilitarianism deals with those specifics. It says, yeah, there are bad things in the world and you should do the things that maximizes happiness. If you want to maximize happiness, and of course we do, then you're going to be taking utilitarianism. That brings me to subpoint C, that we determine we determine rights-based ethics based on a utilitarian framing. What do I mean by that? Rights-based ethics are that, like, I have a right to life, for example. But why do I have that right to life? Why do we agree on that? Because my right to life benefits me, because it is utilitarian to me, which means that rights-based ethics are inherently derived from utilitarianism and just sort of pervert the idea of utilitarianism. If we're going to use utilitarianism in the first place, we should stick with it because it is evidently the one that is maximizing the most happiness, which we care about. The impacts of this is that we can't ever actually determine whether something is moral or not under a rights-based system. That leads to my second contention, that rights-based ethics systems just simply aren't protective enough. In other words, you are given rights, but those rights may be limited. Those rights may not cover you in every circumstance. Very often, my rights don't cover like whether I'm going to be slapped or not, because I don't know, maybe like that's not specifically covered. Maybe these are limited rights. Maybe they're really, really vague. That's especially true because these rights are somewhat confusing. Your right to property doesn't really protect you if people disagree on what constitutes a violation of that property right. For example, I might consider my right to property to mean that you cannot tax me, and if other people disagree on that, my right to property doesn't really protect me in the first place, especially if people can pervert the meaning of that right. In contrast, utilitarianism really does help you, right? Because it tells you, yeah, we're not going to base this on a principle. We're going to get down to the nitty gritty and we're going to say if this does good, then you should do it. And if it does bad, you shouldn't do it. An example of this is a government was truly utilitarian, they wouldn't do bad things. That's the whole appeal of utilitarianism. In a rights-based approach, a government might argue that while you have a right to property, your right to property only extends to you a tiny little square foot of property, whereas the government gets all of the rest of the land, which means that maybe your right to property exists, but it's really not helpful to you if it's only like 1 square foot of property. With that, let's get into the government case. Okay, first let's look at the top of the case here, where my partner asks a POI and asks what rights are and where do we derive them from? And we get a couple examples coming from government, but they're extremely vague. They tell you there are rights that exist under deontology. At the point where we don't even know what these rights are, it's really hard to argue that they even protect you whatsoever. I think it's telling that government can't really give you a list of the ones that we all recognize. And if we can't even recognize or agree on a system of what rights should be protected, what rights will always be protected, it doesn't make sense that those rights will be protected if we as a society can't come to that agreement. You might not consider that I have a right to life in all such circumstances. The first contention is on marginalized groups. First of all, I'm going to note that utilitarianism, there are multiple forms of utilitarianism. Very famously, there's a type of utilitarianism called negative preference utilitarianism, which essentially means that we should be prioritizing minimizing the bad over maximizing the good. Notice how that's different. That is, we decrease suffering even at the expense of like some happiness. That solves for this entire marginalization contention because, yeah, we're always going to prioritize minimizing the abuse of people. And if government's telling you that we need to minimize the abuse of marginalized groups, the way that you measure that is you figure out how much they're being hurt and what you can do. And the way to do that is through utilitarianism. Okay, they also give you a lot of examples where they tell you like utilitarianism would do X and they're just wrong about it. For example, they give you this example where like it would be utilitarian to throw an innocent person in jail. Absolutely, it would not, because that person's innocent, and then they'd have to spend their life in a horrible prison. This is just not a correct definition of what utilitarianism actually is. Let's go to their second contention on probability. Essentially, they're saying that quantifying morality is really, really difficult. And first of all, we say, yeah, things are subjective, but that's not always bad. You can eventually figure things out because people do, as government says, have some conception of what is right and what is wrong, and you can figure it out. But then second is that rights are actually, the like whole rights-based approach is actually more subjective. That is, no one really knows what constitutes a violation of rights. They don't know, even if I have a right to life, they don't know whether you can infringe upon it. For example, if I kill someone, am I allowed to be put in jail, even though that violates my right to movement? Totally unclear from the government case. That's especially true when we can't even agree on what rights are protected in a society and what rights are. And at that point, when you can't even figure out what rights are, and you can't protect them, and they don't protect you very much, I'm so proud to negate.
Okay, great. I'm just going to get out my timer and I will begin my speech of 8 minutes starting in, oh, I'm still Emily, verbal POIs are still good. I'll begin my speech of 8 minutes starting now. Judges, I want to do 3 things in this speech. First, I want to give one overarching observation and clarification. Next, I want to get into side opposition's case and then back to side government's case. So the one thing you continue to hear from side opposition, their one piece of offense that essentially justifies their entire case is, what are these fundamental rights? These fundamental rights are really vague. Judges, there's a reason why when you think to yourself, what is moral, what is morally good, a few things come up. Instrumentalization, agency, equality, freedom. These things are all in your gut. These things are all very, very fundamental. All of society agrees upon them and has agreed upon them. They are fundamental rights. No, I'll take it later if I have time. All of these things are very intuitive. There's something in your gut that tells you to subscribe to them. These are the fundamentals rights we are talking about. They come a priori to anything we will talk about in this debate. We think these are super, super intuitive, a lot more intuitive than side opposition seems. When I say something is morally good, when something is morally justified, most people know what I'm talking about. Most people know that that means that I'm not taking away someone's agency, that I'm not instrumentalizing them, that I'm not taking away someone's equality. Most people seem to understand that. Sure, we can debate about if property is a fundamental right or not, but we don't really think it's in the scope of this debate. Most people probably would or would not agree that it's a fundamental right. I'll get into that a little bit more later. But judges, let's look at the comparative. When we look at how arbitrary or how vague fundamental rights are, look at the comparative. Look to what side opposition is telling you. They're telling you that util is a lot more objective, that it's a lot less vague. But what's their definition of util? It's maximizing happiness. I don't know what that means. I don't know what that looks like in practice. I don't know if maximizing happiness for one person looks the same as someone else. I don't know if one person's definition of maximizing happiness is displacing a whole group of people. I don't know what maximizing happiness actually looks like for one person versus different groups of people. I think we all know intuitively that fundamental rights, maximizing people's fundamental rights at its core, a priori before anything else, simply means that you are not taking away agency of people, that you are not subjecting them to instrumentalizing them or subjecting them to do anything that they will not want to do or that is a fundamental right, which we can all intuitively think about. But this brings me to the second piece of information that I just really, really want to clarify that side opposition talks about. So they bring up in their framing that we should be using the system in everyday life, and that's the scope of this debate. But judges, we think that we should extend the scope of this debate to government decision-making too, i.e. we should look at all different types of decision-making. They talk about land rights themselves. They talk about policy-making themselves. We don't really understand this limited scope. We think that like these ethical systems impact people on an individual level as well as a group level. With that, getting into their first contentions on rights-based ethics are logically contradictory. So first of all, they talk about like rights to infringe on the rights of others. They use the example of displacement, but it seems like side opposition doesn't really know history that well. The rights of Indigenous people did not infringe upon the rights of U.S. settlers. Indigenous people were being displaced as settlers moved west. As they expanded and conquered territory, the U.S. settlers had no rights to this land. What was actually used to justify this displacement? It was utilitarianism. It was what was best, what would maximize happiness for the US settlers. We can completely turn this point, but let's not play example tennis. Let's actually look to warranting. Let's actually look to logic. We tell you that this kind of contradictory, even if you don't buy this, we would tell you that this kind of like contradictory nature of these rights is probably a good thing. We think that it forces people to look more deeply at an issue. If you do not know that, if you see an apparent contradiction, between fundamental rights, that leads to a veil of versatilitude, right? Util is unknown. This outweighs completely. We think this is a good thing. It forces people to look more deeply about an issue. Third response is I read a piece justifying abortion through virtue ethics. Zach reads this piece justifying abortion through virtue ethics, and it was literally the most thorough and thoughtful piece he has ever read on abortion. Why? Because it is able to take into account all types of moral considerations. Fourth response, we think that util leads to reproductive futurism. It leads to a society's obsession with the child. However, this is exclusionary to queer people who are not able to have children. They tell you time and time again that like util is a prereq to our ethical system. They tell you that util is a prerequisite to rights-based ethics, but like we would say, like, why is this true? We can give you the exact logic on the in the other way that tells you that like people's fundamental rights to agency will always be a prereq to util. We can turn this. We don't think that like what's a prereq should really be in the scope of this debate. The second contention is on rights may be limited and they don't cover everything. Judges, this argument is very, very defensive. We think that there are other deliberations in decision-making, as Zach talks a lot about on the top of this case, which they concede. They act as though humans are omniscient creatures. A government is trying to do what is the most util will not necessarily succeed. We think that you can turn the idea that the fundamental rights in traditional rights-based approaches are vague. Restricting agency is something that can literally be applied to everything. Their side is probably the more vague, subjective side. Don't let them try to win on an example. We give you actual logic and warranting for this. We tell you very, very clearly that the warranting Zach tells you very, very clearly is that when you're making ethical decisions, you only look to consequence in their world. You do not look at all on intentionality, which they have no response to. You only look at this impossible definition of good or bad, or this impossible definition of happiness. This means that since everyone has a different understanding of what's good or bad in consequence, what will make them happiest, people don't know what they want, what will make them the happiest, or what will have a good or bad outcome. This leads to inherently more subjectivity, more harmful policy, especially for marginalized groups of people. That's the only piece of warranting you get in this debate on who is actually more subjective. With that, getting into side government's case, first contention on marginalized groups of people, they tell you there's multiple forms of utilitarianism. Judges, this knifes their entire case. They tell you themselves that util has many different forms. Clearly, util is subjective. Clearly, we can't agree on a definition. In your gut, you know that there's only a few fundamental rights. You know that we all agree on those. You don't know what util is. They tell you themselves. But even if you buy this, we think that this is probably negative util. We think that this form probably doesn't apply to the scope of this debate. It doesn't matter, though. They knife themselves with this point. We would say that, like, in util, the individual doesn't matter. They give you this analysis that, like, an innocent person will not go to jail under a utilitarian framework. But judges, what is util util. It's not egoism. Util is telling you that the individual doesn't matter. The overall greater happiness is preferred over the individual, which justifies things like putting an individual in prison for the greater good of society, or what will maximize happiness for society. Second contention on probability. They say that like things are subjective, but you can eventually figure this out because people have a conception of what is right and wrong in consequence. This is A, non-comparative, and B, does not engage with the fact that there are certain things which we understand to be true a priori. And even if you don't buy that, we think that the process of thinking about things through rights, even if specific rights are different, is A, more valuable, and B, probably leads to the same conclusion. Our third contention is not touched. Flow this through completely. The idea that agency is a prereq to anything in this debate. If you are going to vote for the side that is the prereq, it is our side. We are prereqing any good outcome they tell you in this debate by telling you that agency comes first. That's the only clear piece of warranting we tell you in this that we give in this debate. For all those reasons, so proud to propose.
Wonderful. All right. Give me 1 second. Okay. Beginning my time now. If you remember nothing from my speech, remember that it does not matter what rights the government team claims to give you at the point in which they provide no bright line or explanation for why having a right means everyone agrees on what infringes on it. You're going to prioritize a contextualized form of morality at the point in which they don't tell us what constitutes an infringement of a right. They just say, you have the right to life, you have the right to happiness. Util tells you, you have the right to life, you have the right to experiencing a good quality of life, and you're allowed to take into account situational context, so you are able to actually measure and make a decision. Even if util does not tell you exactly what to do, it is a guide. I can intuitively say, if I slap Jacob right now, that is bad because I am hurting Jacob, and that is bad for maximizing happiness. Now, on this major misconception of what utilitarianism is, util is not, I'm gonna do whatever the heck makes me happy regardless of other suffering, like Gov wants you to think it is. This has literally never been util. This is like, this is ridiculous. Though essentially, utilitarianism is the maximization of happiness subtracted by the amount of suffering. However, think about the happiness paradox. We get used to happiness, right? When you get a new car, you are excited for a week and then you're used to it, right? The happiness fades. Pain does not. Suffering does not. When you are suffering, you don't forget the pain. That is why the pain is weighed higher than the suffering. So every time they tell you that utilitarianism ignores marginalized people's suffering is a much larger impact than people owning land and owning property. You cannot claim that indigenous people being genocided and displaced was util in any way, shape, or form. Now, on Gov case. Their first contention is on marginalized groups. We bring up like negative preference utilitarianism, and I talk about the happiness paradox. They say this knifes the op case because evidently util is subjective and they don't know what util is. Judges, negative preference util is just a form of utilitarianism where people are like, hey, I care less about maximizing happiness and more about minimizing suffering. It is just a like subsection of util. For them to be like, util has no definition. They are basically the same thing, except negative preference utilitarianism prioritizes suffering. They are both forms of utilitarianism made by the same philosopher that created utilitarianism. Then they say that we can't measure it. However, you don't need to measure util. It's a guide. I can predict what will create the most good and the most harm. If I punch Jacob, that is going to create harm, and I know that, right? Now, they say they go on their point about innocent people. We say it's not utilitarianism to put innocent people in jail. They say the individual doesn't matter in util. That is just not true. Utilitarianism functions on an individual level. That is why I'm able to be a negative preference rule utilitarian. That is how I self-identify morally. I believe in the minimization of suffering and the functioning of like living under general rules that maximize utilitarian values, right? We tell you this is definitely individual. For them to be like, no, this isn't on an individual level. How do you think individuals make utilitarian decisions when they're not like the president of the United States? This point is ridiculous. Their second thing they say, or they don't respond to our second point that rights are more, or yeah, I guess they respond to it a little on that op case. But on the point that rights are more subjective, they're kind of like, no, util is more subjective. But literally, okay, their warranting for why rights are intuitive is like, everyone knows racism is bad. Everyone knows xenophobia is bad. Judges, why do you think racism and xenophobia exist? Because people don't know that it's bad. For them to be like, rights are intuitive, right? Everyone knows what moral rights are. That's just not true. That's why bigotry exists, right? For them to come up here and say, oh, it's less subjective. No, thank you. I do not have time. I have a lot to get through. For them to come up here and say, oh, like it's more subjective for util because you have to like analyze the context. Analyzing the context makes it less subjective, and the fact that you're not relying on like the person who's making the decision being moral, right? If they talk about government like politicians are not going to be making like government politicians are not going to inherently know what all human rights are. That is why government politicians in the status quo are passing like anti-trans legislation, anti-immigration policy. We tell you at the point in which they literally frame this and extend it to a government level, that's going to be really, really damning. On to the op case. Our first contention is that rights-based ethics are logically contradictory in many instances. Now, they come up and they're like, they don't understand Native people were displaced, settlers, because it was utilitarianism. Judges. Genocide of Native American citizens, displacement of Native American citizens, and the placement of them in reservations that were neglected and underfunded and had poor water conditions and all these things was not utilitarian. Don't let them get away with that. That is absurd. They cannot come up here and say indigenous people being genocided is utilitarian. That is absolutely insane. Now, they talk about how like they wrote like a justification of abortion based on virtue ethics. They don't implicate this though, because the problem with virtue ethics is it relies on you being an ethical person, right? Virtue ethics relies on you having good virtues, i.e., if you wrote a justification of abortion based on virtue ethics, it was because you were valuing the ethics, the virtues and the like ethical traits of, you know, autonomy and all these things that a lot of people just don't believe in. That's why abortion is something debated in the status quo. So at the point in which they don't actually tell you how right-based ethics is supposed to help, at the point in which they don't tell you what constitutes a violation of your rights or what to do when your right infringes on someone else's right, this is just an impossible moral framework to actually live your life by or make policy based on. Extend our points about how this moral framework doesn't actually help, extend that Kant argues that logical contradiction, extend that Kant, the like father of deontology that they cite, argues that logical contradictions are inherently immoral, extend the fact that it's vague and arbitrary, because if you look at what these like ethical rules are, it's literally like you have the right to freedom, you have the right to property, you have the right to autonomy, you have the right to, like, these are literally so random. I can say I have the right to do blah, blah, blah under this framework, right? We tell utilitarianism at least forces you to take into account context and not just make up random rules. Now, our subpoint C was that we determine rights based on ethics and util framing. They say that agency is a prerequisite to utilitarianism. Judges, why is agency important? Because when people have agency, it maximizes societal good, which is utilitarianism. So I'm not really quite sure that this response is responsive at the point at which we tell you that we determine what is a right on util. Why is owning property a right? It's not because I have a moral obligation to own property. It is because it creates like good for me to have a right to property. Our second contention was that right-based ethics systems aren't protective enough. They say this is defensive and there are other things to think about. This is like also not a response. Right-based ethics don't protect you at the point in which they don't take into account context, right? In rights-based ethics, a person attacking me has the right to autonomy and has the right to attack me, but that infringes on my right to personal safety. So what do you do in a situation where you both have conflicting rights? They never tell us that. Now, they say util is more subjective and consequentialism is bad because it doesn't look at intentions. Intentions don't matter. Outcomes matter. People getting hurt matters more than how you felt, right? Like if I'm not intentionally hurting Jacob, but I still hurt Jacob, I'm still hurting Jacob. For those reasons, I'm so proud to negate.
All right, wonderful. Okay. Yes, I'm gonna set up. If government can't name to you which rights exist and what constitutes a violation of those rights, it seems shocking that they would then tell you that those rights can even be respected, because actually they cannot. I think there are three key issues in this round. I want to go over all three of them. The first, which system is more subjective? Because both sides in this round tell you that like each system is really subjective. The simple answer is that the rights-based ethics system is just more subjective. We tell you that no matter how much you think about something in a rights-based system, you cannot make a decision about it because rights are unresolvable. Inherently, rights-based system says you cannot infringe upon this right. Okay, but if we have contradicting rights, then there's no way to get out of that. Maybe taxing me is the only way to protect the rights of marginalized groups or people that really need money, but it may infringe upon my right to property. There is no way out of that contradiction. Some infringement upon my right is the only way to uphold someone else's right, which means you can't do anything and you can't do nothing. There is no way out of this contradiction. In contrast, utilitarianism might be hard. So is morality. Yeah, sometimes it's hard to think about whether a decision's hard, but what you can do is you can think about it, you can figure it out. And as government themselves tells you, you do know about what things are good and bad. My partner gives you this analysis. If my partner slaps me, they know that in fact, yes, that does do harm in the world because it will hurt me. So yeah, maybe it's not always perfect, but you can figure it out. That's in contrast to rights-based ethics, where literally there is no way out of this double bind. Okay, and the impacts of that are, I think, twofold. First, rights-based ethics are actually really unhelpful because if we're arguing which system you should use to make decisions in your common life or which governments should use in their common life to make decisions, it's really unhelpful if a moral system literally cannot tell you, right? Because if I'm trying to figure out whether I should make this decision or not, and the moral system I come back with says, well, I don't know, there's a contradiction, what the hell am I supposed to do? In utilitarianism, I can figure it out. The second impact is that inherently, people who find themselves in this logical contradiction will be self-interested. That is, I will always value my own rights over other people's rights. That goes conceded out of my first speech, out of Ellie's speech. That goes conceded by the government, that people will be more self-interested. So in their next speech, government might tell you that utilitarianism is more subjective because people have a different perception of good. But at the end of the day, government themselves tells you that people have an idea of what is right. Okay. And I think this whole like contradiction thing gets even worse for the government side of this debate at the point where we can't agree what is a right or what constitutes an infringement upon that right. A good example of this is that I have the right to life, but it's totally unclear whether, like, for example, the death penalty is allowed, which means because there are large debates about that, and it's really unclear about that, which means that it's really hard to make these decisions and rights don't really help you. The second voter issue here, the second really key issue in this round is about marginalized groups, because probably in the next speech, government will tell you that utilitarianism ignores individuals. And the simple response to that is that no, it just doesn't. Throwing an innocent person in jail is contrary to utilitarianism because it makes them suffer and doesn't do a good to society. Government really wants you to believe that there's like a simple way that like utilitarianism will totally kill everyone. But at the point where utilitarianism literally takes that into account, it takes into account the fact that doing harm is bad, it's going to prevent that from happening. It makes sense then that you'll probably be voting for the side that is going to actually prioritize things that will do good. Okay. The third voter issue here, the third key idea is that the rights-based ethics system doesn't actually take actions in context. For example, maybe I have a right to movement, but if that right to movement infringes upon other people's rights, you need to have the context around that action. Fundamentally, this rights-based ethics system says, well, this is always true. And that's really hard to decipher when at some points rights-based ethics contradicts itself. And at that point, I'm so proud to negate.
Incredible. Okay, my name is still Zach. My pronouns are still he, him. And if you have any POOs, just let me know verbally. Time will begin in 3, 2, 1. In my 6 years of debate, I've debated with 25 separate partners, but Emily's member of government speech reminded me why she's my favorite partner. I'm going to be doing 2 things in this speech. First, I'm going to be going over the 3 ballots they try to write for you and explaining why each of them are actually government ballots. Second, I'm going to be explaining why even if you cannot come to a decision on any of those 3 ballots, why our argument about a prerequisite, which has never been engaged with, necessarily just wins us the round a priori. But first, let's start on the clash about subjectivity. What do they say? They essentially say that rights are contradictory. But Emily gives you brilliant analysis in the member of government speech. She tells you that contradiction is not the same as clarity. We concede their argument. We agree. Sometimes rights are in conflict. That's not a bad thing. What she tells you is that these rights are clear. In fact, you can turn the argument because Emily reads you this turn and it never gets engaged with. She tells you it's a good thing because it forces you to think more deeply about the issue. It forces you to actually try to understand all of the nuances. They try to preach about contextualization, but only when you try to understand how all of these different forms of rights engage with each other can you truly understand the nuance. That's the argument that Emily reads in the member of government speech. That's the argument that they never respond to. It's incredibly damning for my opponents. The second thing she argues, though, is about the veil of verisimilitude. What she tells you really brilliantly is the fact that when you think that something is true, we understand utilitarian to always be objective. That means that you don't actually have any incentive to think deeply about how it's actually going to look in the real world. The third conceited response out of Emily's speech is the fact that they act as though humans are omniscient. I really do wish that I lived in the world my opponents talked about, in which I was an omniscient being which could understand the consequences of an action 10 years in the future. But we don't live in that world, judges. We live in a world in which people make decisions that are flawed, in which information is flawed. So we can try to determine the impacts of Medicare for all, but we'll never know. We cannot predict the future. That's the argument I read to you in my very first speech, which never gets engaged with. It's the weighing on alternative actors. I tell you that there aren't alternative actors which influence whether something is principally just. This is something we just have in our gut. It's something that, as philosophers, has coined a priori. It doesn't matter your experiences. It's in our gut. What we say about utilitarianism is that this isn't the case. You don't actually see that there are alternative actors. Their only response here is like, why does racism exist if this is in our gut? But what we tell you is that this is because people aren't thinking about things through morality. Emily tells you, and I tell you, both at the top of the case, that there's other forms of decision-making which aren't morality, and that we're purely debating the moral sphere. We're winning on subjectivity. Second is marginalized groups. I think it's telling that opposition tries to change this debate from a debate about utilitarianism to a debate about negative utilitarianism, that they knew they were losing this round. Because that isn't what this motion says. This motion very clearly says utilitarian ethics. I define this in my first government speech. They don't respond to it as abusive in the first opposition speech. They essentially say, well, like displacement of indigenous people is horrible, but they don't respond to the nuance of our argument. We're arguing how these ethical frameworks are applied in the real world. It allows bad actors to justify these atrocities under the veil of utilitarianism. It allows colonizers to say that it is for the greater good, even if it isn't. That's the argument that I read in the PMC. And that's an argument which side opposition has strategically ignored. We tell you that that means we get access to all of our impacts. The second reason we're winning on marginalized groups, though, is Emily's turn on reproductive futurism. She tells you that society is focused on the child, which means that queer people don't have a place in society because they don't create as much utility, apparently. We think this form of viewing the world is incredibly damaging, and it delegitimizes the identity of queer people around the world. We think that this is A, outweigh on probability because they never engage with it, but B, it's literally dehumanizing to people. It has the largest impact on severity. Let's say you don't want to vote on any of those clashes, though. On an epistemological level, we tell you that agency is a prerequisite for happiness because happiness is not intrinsically valuable. We tell you that we only ascribe value to things because we are able to choose them. It's not that debating is morally salient. It's not that debating brings me happiness. It's my ability to choose that I love debating, to choose that debating is something which brings me happiness, that brings me happiness in the first place, to help marginalized groups and to understand that we need to view the world through rights in order to even understand side opposition. I've never been prouder to propose.
All right, nice round, y'all.
Yeah, awesome round, guys. And thank
Thank
you
you.
all so much.
Well done, well done. Congrats. Y'all should be proud y'all made it this far.
Yes. Excellent debate.